Hail EC here, and one of the most iconic developers we can all agree in the history of Nintendo has been their collaboration with Rare. Rare has basically been the most iconic developer for the N64 outside of Nintendo themselves, and really it could have been a nice, prosperous relationship between the two companies. With Rare, adding a bit more of a British flair to obviously Nintendo's library of games and its catalog. However, during 2002, during a bad financial position for both companies, because obviously Nintendo's GameCube was not a huge hit as it was planned to be, and Rare was struggling financially as well. Rare was sold to Microsoft. Now, this was arguably the worst outcome for a lot of people at Rare and for a lot of people in general, because Microsoft, let's be honest, has mismanaged Rare. Put them on making games for the Kinect, made them not really, and really Rare's not really released much outside of Kinect games and like compilations of their old games besides Sea of Thieves, and they just had their game Everwild cancelled, so that's just kind of a big yikes as well. So in this video I'm going to go over why I feel like Nintendo should have bought Rare and why I feel like that would have been more beneficial, not just to Rare but also to everyone who is obviously a fan of obviously games. So let's start with the obvious fact. Nintendo obviously struggled with the N64. They didn't have as much third-party support as say a Sony did with the PlayStation. Now, Rare was obviously one of Nintendo's best second-party developers, and Rare put out a large library of games on the N64. They put out games like GoldenEye 007, Banjo-Kazooie, Conker's Bad Fur Day. They had basically helped corner their own niche in the market for Nintendo 64 content. There's enough games coming from Rare and Nintendo where these two were arguably the primary developers for this system, and the reason you'd buy a N64 would either be to buy Rare's games or to buy Nintendo's games. Rare was also allowed to develop Donkey Kong games, which is very rare for Nintendo at the time, to actually allow outside developers to actually develop their games for them. Nintendo was not willing to license out characters like Donkey Kong, like Mario and stuff, to developers who didn't have a proven track record. And obviously Rare's track record at the time was not that great. They had obviously made a few games for home computers and for the NES, but Donkey Kong Country is where they really got put on the map. And that's also another thing we've got to factor in. After Rare was bought by Microsoft, Donkey Kong just kind of took a back seat. There was not really anything really worth playing with Donkey Kong for a long time. And Donkey Kong Country as a series was put on hold for quite a few years because obviously Rare was no longer allowed to develop it. Likewise, I feel like personally it's kind of weird when you look at the Switch Online expansion pack now and you see so many of the games that they've been licensing coming from Rare. Rare's catalogue has been, revitalised and brought back to the Nintendo systems by obviously licensing the games for Switch Online. And that's something we also need to factor in. These games are arguably half the catalogue of N64 when it comes to how iconic they are, how well known they are and stuff. And it's just kind of weird that Nintendo never made the offer to buy them. Now, there is obviously rumours and speculation on why this happened. One of the reasons is rumoured to be crunch. And because at one point Rare was putting out 4 games a year. Rare was not pulling any punches. They were putting out so many games. And there was such a small British studio. And there's obviously talk of crunch and development times and whatever. And I can understand why that could be a concern for Nintendo. But then also you need to understand that Rare was obviously innovative. Rare had all these ideas. They were pushing stuff so hard. They were trying their best to really bring up, arguably, what I think was the best games they could have made. And I feel like that, alongside what they could have developed for the GameCube, because we all knew they were working on some big stuff for the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance at the time when they were sold to Microsoft. It's honestly just kind of disheartening seeing how badly managed they've been by Microsoft. I know Microsoft is obviously a big company and obviously people are like, big tech is evil and stuff. But let's be real, in this regard, they essentially just drained, Rare of all their creativity and all their joy and all the innovation they had. And for what? DLC updates to Sea of Thieves? Sea of Thieves is not a bad game. That's not me criticising Sea of Thieves. I'm just saying, Rare had so much potential and Microsoft has arguably squandered it. And I kind of wish that Nintendo had just bought them out back then and just let Rare be Rare and do what they do the stuff that they were known for. Let them keep making great games that they were doing, and just keep seeing how people grow. And people would have been huge into that. People would have seen Rare games on obviously Wii, Switch 2, Switch 1, Wii U, DS, all these sort of systems, because they did actually re-release quite a few of their games. Obviously, a few Rare games that were developed like Donkey Kong on Country Series was released on Game Boy Advance, and so was Diddy Kong Racing released on DS. Obviously, with that update obviously removed the Banjo and Conker characters that obviously were developed by Rare and obviously were not owned by Nintendo. But to me, it's just kind of sad that Rare was never part of Nintendo. And I kind of feel like Rare should have been. Like, Rare would have probably been treated a lot better if it was under Nintendo than it was when obviously it was put under Microsoft. But, you know, hopefully maybe in the future we see Rare go independent, or we see Rare get sold to Microsoft, because we're not sold to Microsoft, sold to Nintendo. Hopefully we just see something happen, because it's just kind of disheartening, isn't it? Anyway, guys, let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. Let me know if you agree, if you disagree. Let me know what you think. I've been EC. I'm signing out. Make sure you subscribe, like, all that sort of stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.